She thought she had him cornered. Question after question, she tried to chip away at his credibility, until he turned the tables and exposed the bias in real time. The bright lights of the Los Angeles Broadcasting Center gleamed off the glass table as cameras panned across the studio. The audience was packed. Industry leaders, reporters, and everyday viewers who had managed to secure a coveted seat for the Samantha Blake show. Tonight's guest? Jamal Harrison, CEO of Sentinel Dynamics, a tech conglomerate making headlines for its rapid rise in artificial intelligence and cybersecurity. At just 42, Jamal had built an empire from the ground up, turning a small startup into one of the most influential firms in Silicon Valley. His journey wasn't just about innovation. It was about resilience, about navigating an industry that hadn't always welcomed people like him in leadership roles. But if Jamal was expecting a standard, fair interview, he was in for something else entirely. Samantha Blake was no ordinary host. A veteran in the industry, she was known for her sharp questioning and aggressive interview style. Some admired her no-nonsense approach. Others accused her of veering into unprofessional territory when it suited her. As the countdown flashed on the studio monitors, Jamal adjusted his blazer and took a deep breath. He'd faced boardrooms filled with skeptical investors, competitors who underestimated him, and media narratives that rarely gave him credit for his brilliance. But this was different. It was live television. The red light on the camera flicked on. The show had begun. Welcome back to the Samantha Blake Show. Tonight, we have with us a man who's been called a visionary, a disruptor, and even, dare I say, controversial. Please welcome the CEO of Sentinel Dynamics, Mr. Jamal Harrison. Applause rippled through the audience as Jamal offered a polite nod and a firm handshake. Samantha's smile was bright, but tight, the kind of expression that hinted at an agenda beneath the surface. Jamal, it's a pleasure to have you here, she began smoothly. Thanks for having me, Samantha. Looking forward to the conversation. Oh, I'm sure it will be an interesting one. She flipped through her notes before settling her gaze on him. Let's start with something simple. You've built an empire in the tech world. Sentinel Dynamics is now valued at over $80 billion. But a lot of people are wondering, how does someone like you break into an industry dominated by legacy players? It was a question loaded with implication. Someone like you. Jamal didn't flinch. I don't think success in tech is about legacy. It's about innovation. If you build something that solves a real problem, people will pay attention. Samantha leaned forward. So you're saying it had nothing to do with strategic diversity hires? No one opened doors for you because it looked good on paper? A few murmurs stirred in the audience. Jamal's jaw tensed slightly, but he kept his tone measured. I think my work speaks for itself. We've developed products that are used by government agencies, Fortune 500 companies, and millions of consumers. No one hands you that level of responsibility as a token. Samantha let out a small laugh, shaking her head. Come on, Jamal. Even you have to admit, there are certain advantages in today's climate. And just like that, the game had begun. But Jamal wasn't about to let her dictate the rules. Jamal didn't react right away. He let the silence stretch for a moment, letting Samantha's words settle in the air. The audience shifted in their seats, sensing the shift in energy. Then, with a small, unreadable smile, he leaned forward. Samantha, let me ask you something. Do you think a company like Sentinel Dynamics, one that's responsible for securing critical infrastructure, working with the Department of Defense, and handling multi-billion-dollar contracts, would put someone in charge just to check a box? Samantha's eyes flickered, just for a second. I'm not saying that. I'm just pointing out that the tech world is making a push for more inclusivity, and some might say that plays a role in hiring and investment decisions. Jamal gave a slow nod. Inclusivity is important, but at the end of the day, no investor, no government agency, and no customer will trust a product that doesn't work. Sentinel Dynamics didn't become what it is because someone wanted to push for diversity. It became what it is because we built something better than everyone else. A low murmur rippled through the audience. Samantha didn't flinch, but something in her posture stiffened. She flipped to a new page in her notes. "Let's talk about your background," she said, shifting gears. "You didn't come from the same circles as most Silicon Valley elites. No Ivy League degree, no family connections in tech. You grew up in Baltimore, right?" Jamal nodded. "That's right. Born and raised." "And your parents? Your father was a mechanic, and your mother was a school teacher." "Correct." Samantha tapped her pen against her clipboard. "So let's be real. It's rare for someone with your background to end up in your position. Some might say you beat the odds." Jamal exhaled through his nose. He knew exactly where this was going. "I had to work hard," he said simply. "But I also had great mentors, great teachers, people who saw potential in me and gave me the opportunities to prove myself." Samantha raised an eyebrow. "And yet some would say those opportunities aren't available to everyone. That someone with your exact same background, same intelligence, same work ethic might not have made it because of systemic barriers." The air in the studio thickened. Jamal tilted his head. "Are you asking me if systemic barriers exist?" "Of course they do. But I don't believe in using them as an excuse not to try." Samantha leaned in slightly. "That almost sounds like you're saying people should just work harder and ignore the reality of discrimination." Jamal gave a small chuckle. "No. I'm saying that success isn't about ignoring reality. It's about pushing through it. I knew the world wasn't fair when I was 12 years old. I didn't wait for it to change before I started moving." A few people in the audience clapped. Samantha's lips pressed together, just for a moment. She adjusted in her chair, flipping through her notes again. "Okay, so let's talk about your company's hiring practices. Sentinel Dynamics has been praised for its diversity initiatives. Some people say that's part of why you've been so successful, because you've branded yourself as an inclusive company in a time when that's highly marketable." Jamal's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened. "Samantha, do you know how many of our top engineers have PhDs from MIT, Stanford, or Caltech?" Samantha blinked. 86%, Jamal said smoothly. "Do you know how many of our executive board members have worked at Fortune 500 companies before Sentinel?" Samantha hesitated, just for a second. 72%. Jamal leaned forward slightly. "So tell me, which part of that sounds like we're hiring for optics?" The room was silent, but Samantha wasn't ready to let go just yet. Samantha's smile didn't falter, but her fingers tightened around her clipboard. She wasn't used to guests turning the tables on her, especially not this early in an interview. She let out a light chuckle, flipping to a new page. "Well, Jamal, I'm just playing devil's advocate here. I think it's a fair question, don't you?" Jamal leaned back, giving her a measured look. "It's fair if it's asked across the board. Do you ask every CEO if their success is because of diversity initiatives, or just the ones who look like me?" A few audience members murmured. Samantha's expression remained neutral, but the slight shift in her shoulders gave her away. She cleared her throat. "Let's move on." Jamal smiled. He had expected her to pivot. "Your company has been at the forefront of AI security, but there's also been controversy. Some have raised concerns about privacy risks, particularly with law enforcement contracts. How do you respond to people who say Sentinel Dynamics is contributing to surveillance overreach?" Now that was a real question. Jamal welcomed it. "Look, we take privacy very seriously," he said, his tone shifting to one of firm authority. "Our technology is built with transparency in mind. Unlike some of our competitors, we've set clear ethical guidelines. We don't sell data, we don't enable warrantless surveillance, and we don't work with agencies that violate civil rights." Samantha tilted her head. "That sounds good in theory, but let's be real. Once technology is out there, companies can't always control how it's used." Jamal nodded. "You're right. That's why we build safeguards. Every contract we sign has oversight requirements. If a client misuses our tech, we have the right to terminate agreements. We've done it before." Samantha arched an eyebrow. "So you're saying you're holding law enforcement accountable?" Jamal didn't hesitate. "Absolutely. And that's exactly why I started this company, to make sure this technology is used responsibly." For the first time in the interview, Samantha seemed slightly off balance. She had expected him to be defensive, to stumble, but he was too prepared. So she shifted gears again. "Speaking of responsibility," she said, her voice turning sharper, "let's talk about your leadership. There have been whispers about your management style, former employees claiming you're overly demanding, that you run Sentinel like a dictatorship. What do you say to those allegations?" Jamal's jaw tightened, just slightly. Now they were getting into the character attacks. "I expect excellence," he said evenly. "Sentinel Dynamics isn't a startup in a garage. We handle critical infrastructure. We don't get second chances. If that makes me demanding, then I accept that." Samantha let out a small laugh. "That's a very polished answer, but I have to ask, do you think some of this criticism comes from employees who feel intimidated by you?" Jamal's expression remained neutral, but his voice cooled. "You mean because I hold them to a high standard? Or because of something else?" The room went silent. Samantha paused, and in that split second she realized she had walked right into it. Jamal didn't break eye contact. "I've noticed something, Samantha. When CEOs like Elon Musk or Steve Jobs were called demanding, people said they were visionaries. But when a CEO like me is demanding, suddenly it's intimidation." The audience reacted. A mix of hushed whispers and scattered claps. Samantha sat back, trying to regain control. "That's not what I meant, isn't it?" Jamal's voice was calm, steady. "Because I've heard this before. When I'm direct, I'm aggressive. When I set high expectations, I'm intimidating. But when my counterparts do the same, they're innovators." The murmurs grew louder. Samantha glanced toward her producers, but they were frozen, watching the moment unfold. But Jamal wasn't finished. Jamal let the silence settle. He had learned long ago that pauses could be just as powerful as words. Samantha shifted in her chair, her fingers tapping against her clipboard, a subtle but telling sign of discomfort. He could feel the audience watching, waiting. Finally, Samantha exhaled, forcing a tight smile. "Jamal, I think you're taking this a little personally. I'm simply asking questions that people want answered." Jamal's lips twitched slightly. "Of course. But let's be clear about what's happening here. You aren't just asking about my leadership style, you're questioning whether I deserve to be here in the first place." The air in the room thickened. Samantha opened her mouth, but Jamal continued. "I've been in this position before. A boardroom where people wondered if I was really the right choice. A conference where my competitors assumed I was someone's assistant. A pitch meeting where an investor told me I didn't seem like the typical tech CEO. Samantha's expression faltered. "You know what the common thread is, Samantha?" Jamal leaned forward. "None of those people ever asked me about my vision, my strategy, the work I put in. They all focused on everything but the actual business I built." The audience was completely silent now. Even Samantha, for all her experience handling tough guests, seemed momentarily at a loss. But Jamal wasn't done. "So let's flip this around," he said, his voice calm but unmistakably firm. "Let's talk about what actually matters. Sentinel Dynamics employs over 12,000 people across the country. We've revolutionized cybersecurity in ways that are actively preventing data breaches that could cost companies billions. We've developed AI systems that are protecting everything from power grids to hospitals. We are one of the few tech companies that turned a profit in its first 5 years. And yet, we've spent this entire interview talking about whether I belong instead of the work I've actually done." Samantha opened her mouth, but Jamal lifted a hand slightly, signaling he wasn't finished. "So here's my question for you, Samantha." His voice didn't rise, but the weight of it filled the room. "If I looked different, if my background were different, would we be having this same conversation?" Samantha blinked. A muscle in her jaw twitched. The question hung in the air, thick with an unspoken truth that was impossible to ignore. The audience knew the answer. The viewers at home knew the answer. And most importantly, Samantha knew the answer too. She forced a short laugh, but it was thinner now, stretched tight around discomfort. "Jamal, I think you're reading too much into this. I was just playing devil's advocate." Jamal tilted his head slightly. Why is it always a devil that needs an advocate? A few people in the audience let out a surprised, "Oh." Samantha's face froze for a fraction of a second. Jamal sat back, exhaling softly. "You want a headline, Samantha? Here's one. CEO talks about his company instead of justifying his existence." A beat of silence. Then, applause. Scattered at first, but growing. A ripple moving through the audience, turning into something undeniable. Some stood. Others clapped hesitantly at first, then with conviction. Samantha glanced toward her producers, her polished exterior faltering just slightly as she realized she had lost control of the narrative. But Jamal wasn't playing her game anymore. The clapping didn't stop. If anything, it grew louder. A standing ovation wasn't typical for an interview segment, especially not this early, but there was no denying what had just happened. Jamal had turned the conversation on its head. Samantha shifted in her chair, gripping her pen a little too tightly. She forced a small chuckle, trying to maintain control. "Well, that was certainly passionate," she said, her voice thinner than before. "But I do think we should move on to—" A voice from the audience cut through. "Answer the question!" The room turned toward the source. An older man in the third row. He wasn't angry. If anything, his face was curious, almost amused. He leaned forward, gesturing slightly. "Would you be asking him the same things if he were someone else?" Samantha stiffened. "Sir, we have a format to follow." Another voice. "He's right." A woman this time, younger, seated closer to the stage. "Why did you focus so much on how he got here instead of what he's done?" More murmurs spread through the audience. Samantha's fingers curled subtly against her clipboard. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. Jamal watched, quiet but attentive. He could feel the shift in energy, the way the room had stopped seeing this as just another interview. Samantha cleared her throat, attempting to regain composure. "I ask tough questions to all my guests. That's my job." Jamal nodded, finally speaking again. "Fair enough. But let's go back through the last 5 interviews you've done with other tech CEOs. How many of them did you ask if they were diversity hires?" Silence. Samantha blinked once, then twice. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out immediately. The audience was watching her now, not Jamal. "Let's be real," Jamal continued, his tone calm but firm. "You weren't asking that for transparency. You were asking it because it's a question people like me always get, no matter how much we achieve." Samantha forced another smile. "Well, Jamal, I think we've covered that topic enough." Jamal exhaled slightly. "I agree. Let's talk about my actual work now." The audience chuckled. It wasn't just a laugh, it was approval. Samantha had no choice but to move on. She flipped through her notes, but her usual confidence had wavered. She had lost control of the interview. But the real shift? That was happening beyond the studio walls. The moment the interview ended, Jamal stepped off the stage, shaking hands with the producers and making his way toward the green room. The energy in the air was unmistakable. Something had shifted. Back in the studio, Samantha Blake maintained her usual polished composure, but anyone watching closely could see the difference. She wrapped up the segment with a carefully crafted closing statement, but it was clear. She had lost control of the narrative. And outside of that studio, the world was already watching. Within minutes, the clip began circulating. At first, it was just a few posts on Twitter, short captions like, "Jamal Harrison just gave the most powerful interview of the year," and "Watch how he dismantles the bias in real time." But then it spread. News outlets picked it up. Podcasts debated it. Talk shows replayed it. By the time Jamal was in his car heading back to his office, his phone was vibrating non-stop. Texts from colleagues, missed calls from journalists, a flood of emails from supporters, strangers, industry leaders. At 10:17 p.m., Sentinel Dynamics' official website crashed from the sudden spike in traffic. At 11:42, a prominent news anchor tweeted, "This isn't just about one interview. This is about how we view leadership in America." By the next morning, hashtags like #Jamal Harrison Speaks and #The Question That Changed Everything were trending. The reactions weren't just coming from social media users. High-profile figures started weighing in. A former senator tweeted, "Brilliant. He exposed the bias without raising his voice once." A well-known journalist admitted, "I've done hundreds of interviews. That moment, that was a masterclass in control." Of course, not everyone was celebrating. Some commentators tried to reframe the conversation, calling Jamal's response overly defensive or calculated outrage. Others defended Samantha, claiming she was just doing her job. But the overwhelming consensus? Jamal had sparked a conversation that couldn't be ignored. A few days later, an opinion piece in a major publication summed it up best. The issue isn't whether Samantha Blake's questions were intentional or not. The issue is that every successful black leader has been asked some version of them at some point in their career. Jamal Harrison didn't just answer for himself. He answered for everyone who has ever had to prove they belong in a space they already earned. Samantha Blake remained quiet on the matter for days. Her network, sensing the shift in public opinion, carefully avoided the topic on subsequent broadcasts. Meanwhile, Jamal? He wasn't focused on the controversy. He was focused on the impact. Jamal sat in his office, watching the interview clip play on his laptop. He had seen it a dozen times now, not because he enjoyed the attention, but because he wanted to understand the moment. What had made this different? It wasn't the confrontation. He had faced worse. It wasn't even the question itself. He had been asked that before, just not on such a public stage. It was the response. For the first time, the conversation wasn't brushed aside. People were actually listening. His phone buzzed again. Another journalist requesting an interview. Another corporate executive sending a message of support. But what stood out most were the emails. Hundreds of them. From young professionals, from students, from employees in boardrooms who had sat in meetings just like the one he described. "I've been in that seat before. You said what I never had the chance to say. Thank you for showing that we don't have to justify what we've already earned." Jamal leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. This wasn't about him anymore. The truth was, he didn't need validation from social media or the press. He had built Sentinel Dynamics long before that interview. He had proved himself long before that stage. But what mattered now was the message. He had spent years in rooms where people doubted him before they even knew his name, where he had to be twice as prepared, twice as composed, twice as patient. And yet, despite all that, he had never stopped moving forward. And now, millions of people had seen it firsthand. He picked up his phone and finally typed out a response to the media requests. "I appreciate the interest, but I don't need another interview. The work I do every day. That's my statement." He pressed send, then looked out his office window. Because in the end, the best response wasn't a viral moment. It was continuing to build something that no one could ignore. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to think about the narratives we accept without question. How often do we let bias shape the way we see leadership? The way we measure success? More importantly, how do we change it? Share this video. Keep the conversation going, because real change doesn't happen in a single interview. It happens when people refuse to stay silent.